Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode where I'm going to be talking to Dr. Mark Solms, who is an expert on brains, neuroscience, and consciousness. So that's going to be the topic of today's discussion. And you've written a book recently as well, which is The Hidden Spring, A Journey to the Source of Consciousness, which is I guess we're going to be talking broadly about the topics that are in here. So if people are interested, I can put links to the description for that, and you can go and buy it. But I suppose for people who don't know, and someone said in the chat, who is Mark Solms? So what is it that you do now? And could you fill people in on some of your areas of interest in research and so forth?
Yeah, I'm professor in neuropsychology at the University of Cape Town. I spent many years living in London. So I'm also an honorary lecturer in neurosurgery at the Royal London Hospital School of Medicine. I started out my research career studying brain mechanisms of dreaming, and that led me to where I always wanted to end up, which is brain mechanisms of consciousness more generally. Currently, that's my main focus, and in particular, the sort of wild problem of artificial consciousness is what's preoccupying me most of all at the moment.
Awesome. So in your book, you sort of wove in with some of the scientific findings and some of your interpretations and thoughts around the research, your personal story of interest. So I suppose growing up in South Africa, some sort of philosophical questions early on, and also an incident that happened to your brother, all things that sort of led to you, I suppose, committing yourself to trying to figure out this question of what consciousness is, what makes up a person, what is it to be? Could you fill people in with a little bit of what your personal story is, I suppose, that brought you into what you're doing now?
Sure. Actually, I think that these sorts of questions, abstract and complicated as they appear to be, that many children, if not most children, ponder them at some point. Why am I here? What happens after I die? What is it to actually be? As opposed to not be. We underestimate children. I think that I was probably confronted by these questions a little earlier and a little more dramatically than most of us, because when I was just a little over 4 years old, my elder brother suffered a brain injury and went off to another city where he was looked after by neurosurgeons, and came back home alive, looking the same, but not being the same. He was not the same person. So it was, deeply, it was distressing, of course, to all concerned. It's probably the single biggest event, not only in my life, my brother's life, but in my entire family's life. But what was disturbing to me was how come, because a part of his body has been injured, how come he's not the same? Where is my previous brother? How can it be that you become literally a different person as the result of tissue damage? And that children, being as egocentric as they are, also quickly led me to realize that if my brother can be so altered by damage to his body, and since bodies are mortal things, what's going to happen to me? I wouldn't say that at that moment I decided I'm going to be a neuroscientist, but I'm quite sure that is why not only I became a neuroscientist, but why in particular I became a neuropsychologist, which is the subdiscipline of the neurosciences that looks at this relationship of how subjective experience, psychology, relates to physical matter, in this case neurological matter. So that was the origin of my interest in this problem. I really felt a need to engage with it.
You also talk in the book a little bit about, I suppose, in terms of your formal training in academia, I suppose people can be in their kind of silos of the disciplines that they're in, like knowledge silos, whereas it seems like you jumped around a little bit. So you talked about how sort of what was the norm, psychoanalytic thought, sort of coming out of Freud and Jung and so forth, had been mainstream, and then it was kind of frowned upon, I guess, as other things were sort of in vogue. And for you, because you were trained in one area, and then you came into the neuroscience, and you were sort of interpreting things, but through the lens of some of the kind of thought of Freud and those sorts of people, how that informed your thinking about neuroscience. How did you come to bridge gaps between some of these disciplines, and how has that been valuable to you? You're muted, by the way.
Yeah, sorry, I just saw that. I was pushing the wrong button. Don't overestimate professors. There are two issues here. The one is, given what we've just discussed about what the personal foundations were for my interest in how the brain relates to the mind, it was really very disappointing for me when I entered the field, which was in the early 1980s, to discover that what I thought of as the mind, in other words, me, being, sentient existence, was not what my professors meant by the mind. They meant these abstract information processing diagrams. I kept on looking at these diagrams and sort of wondering, well, where is this sentient experiencing person, processing all this information? Where are they in the diagram? And when I asked these sort of naive questions, my professors kindly actually advised me not to ask them, that they were bad for my career. But bearing in mind, I wasn't motivated by the desire for a successful career so much as the need to understand this. For that reason, I was driven to take an interest in psychoanalysis, which, for all its faults, and let's not be unclear about that, psychoanalysis has many problems, but what it has in its favor is it's never shied away from studying experience, lived experience, and trying to understand the structure and functions of the mind from that starting point. So that was one reason why I was drawn to, I wanted to, and I did, study psychoanalysis and train in psychoanalysis in order to supplement, to ameliorate what was missing in my primary education. As Oliver Sacks put it at the time, what was missing from neuropsychology was the psyche. So I wanted to put the psyche back into neuropsychology, and psychoanalysis offered that. The other reason was that, as I mentioned a minute ago, my early research, and in fact it began with my doctoral research in my neuropsychological training, was in brain mechanisms of dreaming. By the way, the reason I studied that was because the one aspect of consciousness those days that was a respectable topic was sleep versus waking, arousal processes. So the experience, having conscious experiences while you're asleep, is extremely intriguing and odd phenomenon. And as my findings emerged in my doctoral study, so it became clear to me that the paradigm in my own field, namely that dreams were sort of meaningless froth, the products of a very degraded level of functioning in the brain while we were asleep, that they were far more psychologically interesting than that. And at bottom, they were motivated, emotionally motivated mental states. I say that because I was looking at where damage in the brain leads to a cessation of dreaming. And I found that there's this thing called the mesocortical mesolimbic dopamine system, which if there's any part of the brain which is a kind of desire or wanting, wishing kind of system, that's it. And so I found it intriguing that the evidence, flew in the face of the idea that dreams were psychologically unmotivated, that they were just random noise and so on. So it gave me a little bit more respect for Freudian thinking than most, or if not just about all of my colleagues had at the time. So those were the two reasons. I think the former was the main one. In other words, looking for a way of bringing subjectivity, conceptualizing subjectivity into neuropsychology. But I think that I wouldn't have been as brave as I was to as my colleagues at the time said to me, it's like an astronomer studying astrology, and it's not a good move. But I think that the emerging findings of that early research of mine gave me more confidence that it wasn't an entirely crazy thing to do.
In terms of your personal opinion on the subject, sort of through those experiences, I think a lot of people would say that today within neuroscience, maybe there's like a sort of mean, hard-nosed materialist kind of spirit that might overlook certain questions, whereas it seems like you're saying, well, actually, back in the day, in the wake of this kind of positivism and behaviorism and stuff like that it was almost just the same or worse. Do you think it's sort of more open-minded now to asking these questions and sort of being wrong than it was back then? Do you think there was almost more of a hard-nosed attitude towards the sort of like that kind of Freudian stuff, that's all, astrology, like you said, it's all sort of pseudoscience, or is it more like that now?
No, I think that it's changed dramatically. I mean, let me put it this way. I think that neuroscience, mainstream neuroscience, the sorts of questions that interested me in the early 80s are now mainstream questions. I think it's widely regarded, consciousness is widely regarded as the main problem facing neuroscience, if not the whole of natural science. And most of the people within my field now engaging with that problem are entirely respectable. So the sorts of constraints that faced me as a student don't exist anymore. That said, I wouldn't want to confuse an interest in subjectivity with an interest in psychoanalysis. I think that's still a very marginal interest for any neuroscientist. But it's also not so, I was frowned upon I actually trained, when was it? The late 1980s, I began my training, and early 1990s was when I qualified as an analyst. Then it was, completely a career-destroying move. Now people are much more open-minded. They don't, it's not as if they want to do the same thing, but they don't think I'm a nutter. The neuroscience has become far more interesting and far more psychological and far more philosophically sophisticated in the last 20 years than it was those days.
So I think if we start talking about then some of the areas of the brain that might be involved in the production of consciousness, and I guess the question is, or what people thought for a long time, as you put forward in your book, is that it's sort of, it's the outer stuff that's involved in producing consciousness, whereas the kind of the older systems that are more towards the center, that they're not so involved. That whatever they've got to do, it's not to do with consciousness. This is going to be a higher order, because there's something special about maybe it's humans where consciousness is like particular to us and maybe not other animals, which might be a bit of an older prejudice. Do you want to start talking about some of the anatomy of the brain and some of the evidence and research that led to you sort of going back towards the systems that are in the kind of brainstem and thinking about, well, actually it seems like that might be where consciousness is rather than in those outer layers?
I think it's entirely reasonable that we started by assuming that consciousness has something to do with our representation of the outside world. And our conscious representation of the outside world is cortical. So, what is your consciousness dominated by? Vision and perception more generally. So, the early neuroscientists, I'm speaking now of the late 19th century, they identified correctly that visual consciousness, exteroceptive consciousness, and all of the cognition that flows from it is cortical. But then there was a completely unexpected discovery in the mid 20th century, which was rather downplayed, I think, because it was such a shock. I'm referring to the work of Magoon and Maruzzi, where they discovered that cortical consciousness is entirely dependent upon arousal by brainstem structures. So they're very primitive nuclei in the brainstem, which activate the cortex. And if those structures are not doing so, the cortex is not conscious. In other words, the cortex is not intrinsically conscious. Its consciousness relies upon brainstem arousal. And the way that we thought about it at the time, because it was such a shock, was, oh, well, this is evidently some sort of power supply, like a television set needs to be plugged in. That doesn't mean that the power source, the electrical socket in the wall is where the televisual stuff is really happening. It's just that this is a prerequisite that needs to be switched on. That's how we understood it. And it was only in the late 1990s that evidence accumulated sufficiently for us to realize that that's not the case, that the upper brainstem, the prerequisite for consciousness, is not just a power source, that it has a quality and a content of its own. And that is feeling, what is technically called affect. That things like hunger and thirst, sleepiness, pain, but also emotions, like fear and anger and lust and so on. These are generated by those structures. And if you want, I can go into all the evidence for that. There are multiple converging lines of evidence that this so-called power supply has quality and content, and that quality and content is affective feeling.
I was going to ask how. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, how is it that we came to sort of know this, or that we can have confidence in that kind of assessment?
Well, let me start with the most dramatic evidence, which is that if the cortex were the seat of consciousness, then the ABCs of behavioral neuroscience require that if you remove the cortex from the equation, then you must be removing consciousness from the equation. Consciousness defined as qualitative, contentful experience. But that isn't what happens. Not only in experimental animals, where I'm sorry to say this has been done surgically, in thousands of instances. You remove the cortex from an animal, it stays awake, it doesn't go into a coma, and it continues to behave in a purposeful fashion and express emotions, and in fact express them rather more intensely than an animal with cortex. But the same applies to human beings, in whom obviously this operation isn't done. But there's a condition called hydranencephaly, which applies to kids who are born without a cortex. And these kids, not only are they conscious in the sense that they wake up in the morning and go to sleep at night, and sadly many of them have absence seizures, so they also lose consciousness and regain it with seizures. But much more importantly, they are emotionally responsive. They show all the basic emotions. They show fear, they show frustration, they show joy and pleasure, they show attachment bonds. They show all of the fundamental emotions, and they show them in a situationally appropriate way. In other words, only when frustrated do they get angry. Only when tickled do they giggle. And so on. So it's very difficult to believe that these kids are not conscious. But of course, they can't speak to us, so we don't know. It just looks as if they're conscious. They behave as if they're conscious. All the external evidence is that they're conscious emotionally. And remember, that's what I'm saying, that the upper brain stem appears to generate this background arousal, which is necessary for the cortex to be conscious, is an affective, felt, valenced arousal. But because those kids can't speak to us, we don't rely on only that evidence. There's a plethora of other forms of evidence, and I'll just quickly whiz through some of it. You take a deep brain stimulator, an electrode, and you put it into the part of the brainstem concerned, and we're talking about the reticular activating system, and you can stimulate intense emotional states. I mean, really intense emotional states. Nowhere else in the brain can you stimulate such intense affective, felt states of deep depression, intense rage, profound fear, and so on, than in those brainstem nuclei. You stimulate the cortex, you get nothing of the kind. In addition, if you image the brain, which is the best method for this, positron emission tomography, when people are in intense emotional states, you have a look at, well, where is the activation in the brain that's generating this intense state? And the activation is abundantly clearly in subcortical structures, in particular in the upper brain stem, in these reticular structures I'm speaking of. And then just to conclude this whistle-stop tour of the evidence, the drugs that we give, in fact, the drugs that are given by psychiatrists, the mainstay of psychopharmacology, drugs like antidepressants, anti-anxiety drugs, antipsychotic drugs, and so on, they all act on the neurotransmitters that are sourced in the reticular activating system. Things like dopamine and serotonin and noradrenaline and so on. We forget that although they activate the cortex, in other words, the neurotransmitters are released into the cortex, the source cells for those neurotransmitter systems are in the reticular activating system. So pharmacological evidence, imaging evidence, deep brain stimulation evidence, lesion evidence, all leads us to the same conclusion. And eventually the weight of the evidence is just, overwhelming. So I would like to hear some evidence against the view that what the brainstem is generating is not just some sort of quantitative arousal dimension. In fact, the very word arousal sort of implies feeling, but it's not just quantitative, it's qualitative in this specific way. So the conclusion is that if the cortex can only generate consciousness when activated by the brainstem, and if the brainstem is generating a affective consciousness, that the conclusion has to be that the foundational form of consciousness is feeling, is affect. We feel our way into our cognitions. If I can just add one further bit of evidence, come to think of it, there's also it accumulated in the last decades of the 20th century, the evidence that the cortex, which does all of these very complicated and impressive, I'm impressed by what the cortex does, and I'm very glad to have a cortex. All of those intellectual cognitive gymnastics that the cortex performs, it can perform the very same functions without being conscious. So, it's not only that the cortex is not intrinsically conscious, in other words, that its consciousness is, as it were, borrowed from the brainstem or derived from the brainstem, but the cortex, left to its own devices, doesn't go to sleep. It functions. If it's not being palpated by this affective arousal, which I'm calling sort of feeling your way into your cognitions carry on just fine without you. That's another very important thing, is alongside our discovery that what the brainstem is generating which is the foundational form, the necessary prerequisite for consciousness, is this affect. All this other stuff to do with external perception and the cognitions derived from the representation of the outside world, all of this other stuff can in fact go on in the dark, as David Chalmers puts it. It doesn't require any subjective feeling in itself.
Something you didn't mention too much there, and that I think you did mention it, but you talk about this region called the periaqueductal gray, or PAG, PAG. Could you talk a little bit about what that does and why that's important?
Yeah, so the reticular activating system, which is the part of the brainstem I've talked about so far, activates the cortex and in fact the whole forebrain. And then there's a descending return signal, as it were, back to the brainstem from our cortical cognitions and perceptions. And all of those descend on the periaqueductal gray. And in fact, on a structure right next to it called the superior colliculi. So all of our, I'm going a little bit ahead of myself probably when I say this to you, but the way that the cortex functions is that we have certain expectations based on what we've learned about how the world works. We expect, if I do this, then that will happen. And the gap between what we expect and what actually happens, we call error signals. And those error signals descend upon those two structures I've just mentioned. So you could think of the reticular activating system as the sort of ascending activating of the forebrain, and then the periaqueductal gray and its adjacent structures is, the descending sort of return signal of, okay, this is what you thought would happen. Well, this is what has actually happened. But the periaqueductal gray, the way I've put it so far, I'm making it sound too cognitive. When I mentioned earlier that if you stimulate reticular activating structures, you get intense emotions, and I said you don't get anything like that if you stimulate cortex. Well, the one place where you get even more intense feelings is by stimulating the periaqueductal gray. It is the part of the brain which generates the greatest range of affects and the greatest intensity of affects. So what that suggests to us is that feedback, that sort of how have things turned out compared to how I expected them to turn out, has a hell of a lot to do with how you feel. And if you think about it, Nathan, in relation to your own life, I hope that is sort of, I hope that sounds familiar to you. Whether things turn out as you expect them to or don't. And when I say as you expect them to, it frequently has to do with how you want them to turn out. If things don't turn out as expected, this is a problem. Then we must remember we don't only have one set of needs. So we have a range of different needs. And the feelings that are generated in the periaqueductal gray seem to be error signals registered in relation to our multiple needs. So it's the sort of final common path, final destination of whether our wishes and wants have worked out or not. And that becomes the basis for the next action cycle, which is then activated by the reticular activating system. So sort of a circular feed-forward feedback business.
So I'm just thinking, because of there's so much to talk about, and just because of time and stuff, I want to get the most out of the time that we do have. Maybe could you if you were to briefly mention just as well the sort of influence that Jaak Panksepp and his work in on effective neuroscience has had on your work and your thinking about the way that the brain works here.
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier that my dream, my research into the brain mechanisms of dreaming led me to the observation that this mesocortical, mesolimbic dopamine system drives dreams. Damage to that circuit leads to a loss of dreaming. Stimulation of that circuit produces excessive dreaming, and that's electrical stimulation, chemical stimulation. Imaging of the brain during dreaming, that's the circuit that's clearly lit up like a Christmas tree. I didn't know much about this circuit. So, I was intrigued and plowed into the literature and came upon the name of Jaak Panksepp. He called that circuit the seeking system. His colleague Berridge called it the wanting system. And, it was just bearing in mind where my frustrations had, what I had said earlier about, neuropsychology didn't seem to really be dealing with the actual stuff of life. It was all about these kind of desiccated cognitive information processing systems. This was, what I originally assumed the brain would be, making feelings and making things that matter to me and so on. I dug deeply into Jaak Panksepp's work, which was alongside that system, which he called seeking. He had identified various other circuits which do similar basic emotional things. So, what Panksepp identified is nothing other than a foundational taxonomy of what the elemental feelings of the human being are. And as it turns out, not surprisingly, they're not uniquely human at all, that we share these circuits, in fact, with not only other primates, but with all mammals. So I befriended him in the late 1990s, and he became my closest scientific collaborator until his death in 2015. All of these emotion circuits that I'm talking about, all of them descend on the periaqueductal gray. And not only emotional circuits, because you must remember feelings are not only emotions, they're also bodily feelings: hunger, thirst, sleepiness, pain, the need to urinate, etc. All of our needs, emotional and bodily, are registered in the periaqueductal gray. And it was Jaak Panksepp who taught me that. My book is in fact dedicated to his memory. He died in 2015, sadly.
So I suppose the next kind of avenue to go down then on our whistle stop tour of the whole theory is looking for sort of an explanation within physics. So trying to offer maybe a more sort of fundamental reduction of some of the stuff that's going on to try and get a bit more towards consciousness. And the way that you do this in the book is by, well, you talk about some other research to do with entropy, some stuff to do with information processing, and but from physics, which then was really informative to your research. So what was it that you found out, and how was that useful for informing the way that consciousness might work in the brain?
Well, let's go back to where we began, and we spoke about it's understandable that we and our discipline, my discipline, and back in philosophy of mind, likewise, that we started from the assumption that consciousness is this external perceptual stuff, and the memories and cognitions derived from it, and that's really complicated stuff. So it's to find a physical theory. I mean, like reducing it to mechanisms. How does this qualitative banquet come about that is our everyday experience? It's been an impossible task to reduce all of this to physics, to simple natural scientific causal account. But feelings, affects, once we recognize that actually the foundational form of consciousness is is affect. And affect is a measure of deviations from where you need to be. All of the affects I've mentioned in our conversation, things like fear. Fear is a deviation from where you need to be, which is not in danger. Rage is a deviation from where you need to be, which is not having impediments, frustrating impediments placed between or placing themselves between you and what you need. Pain is a deviation from where you need to be, which is not suffering tissue damage. Thirst is a deviation from how much water your body needs, etc. What I'm referring to is a mechanism called homeostasis. It's one of the most basic of biological mechanisms. Is literally how we stay alive, that we living things have to remain within our viable bounds, and deviations from those viable bounds are homeostatic error signals, and that's what feelings are. We know how we're doing by feeling our way through these needs. Thirst is an unpleasant feeling because it's bad for you to not have the water supplies that you need. And quenching that thirst is a pleasant feeling because it's good for you. And so these feelings are what motivate us to do what we do fundamentally. Now, to the point, homeostasis is not a very complicated thing. Just think about the mechanism I've just described to you. There's a set point. That's where you need to be. Deviation from it's bad. What must you do? You must do something to get back. So this mechanism is really quite easily reduced to physical laws. The laws of homeostasis are relatively easily described. An extended form of homeostasis is what feeling is. And so that's I teamed up. Perhaps the only other scientist who's had as much of an influence on me and to whom I'm as grateful as Jaak Panksepp is Carl Friston. And Carl Friston was doing work on the sort of physics of homeostasis, of how living systems remain within their viable bounds. And when I more or less stumbled upon his work, I say stumbled, I don't want to pretend that it was some kind of, that I discovered him. I mean, he was super famous, but I wasn't aware of it. And I was aware how famous he was, but I wasn't aware of his work. I didn't acquaint myself with it in any great depth until sort of 2015, 2016 or thereabouts. And realizing that what he had reduced homeostasis to basic physical laws, in fact, mathematical equations he'd written. And I thought, my God, if feeling is an extended form of homeostasis, then it must be possible to similarly reduce feeling to physical, to computable processes. And so that's the work that I then did with him. Was to extend his equations into the affective field, and that's when I said at the very beginning, when I introduced who I am, and I said that what most preoccupies me at the moment is this kind of wild possibility of an artificial consciousness actually being able to engineer this mechanism. That's what flows from being able to bring feeling, the simplest foundational form of consciousness, into physical science. So it's terribly exciting stuff.
So I think as you describe that homeostatic mechanism, for a lot of people, myself included, our sort of intuition is that there's this kind of teleology built into it, whereas our best physics, I suppose, I mean, it's a contentious debate in philosophy of science, is that like teleology doesn't really exist in that sense in nature, and I think the model that doesn't include teleology of what's going on in our best physics of trying to reduce what's going on, this idea of these like Markov blankets, where there's like a kind of representation internally which is fully reducible to sort of blind causes, as it were, as opposed to sort of there being this goal orientedness to causation. are these Markov blankets? How do they work? How do they inform? How do they come from out of like statistical modeling and physics and so forth, and inform then what consciousness might be, or maybe by way of analogy of what consciousness might be doing for the human organism?
Well, let's start from the biological end of things. When you say that, with a kind of a reprimanding tone of voice, well, that's teleological. Actually, biology is teleological. There is an aim and a purpose to life, which is to survive. And to reproduce, which is reproduction is just an extended form of survival. So keeping the species going is what we are all about. Biological things, not only creatures, all living things have a value system which gives rise to an aim and a purpose, which is to survive long enough to reproduce. So feelings, I said to you a little while ago, if we're trying to stay within these homeostatic bounds, feelings are how we represent that value system to ourselves, that it's bad to go out of your viable bounds, in other words, to die, and it's good to stay within your viable bounds. That's how living things operate. So the intriguing question is, well, how does that come about? Now we go out of biology into physics, because living things, long as they've been here, were preceded by an even longer time when there were no living things. So living things emerged from physical processes which precede them and cause them and explain them. So that takes us to a intriguing world of self-organizing systems. Self-organizing systems, all living things are self-organizing systems, but not all self-organizing systems are living things. In fact, the simplest of self-organizing systems are things like crystals. So the fact that we have a physics of how it happens that a system comes about, a system by which I mean something that separates itself from the not system. There's a thing which separates itself from other things and maintains and works to maintain its own existence. I don't want to get too abstruse here, but I'm sure many of our listeners know the second law of thermodynamics. So one of the basic laws, that entropy always increases in any natural process. Things disperse, things dissipate. Organization reduces. So living things. I should rather say self-organizing systems, which is the kind of prototypical system that gives rise to living things, are defined by resisting dissipation. They work. When I said that we have an aim and a purpose, well, self-organizing systems have a kind of proto-intentionality, which is that what they do, and they arise naturally. There's nothing spooky, it just naturally happens that self-organizing systems come about, which is systems which work to maintain their own existence. So that's where we get to. That's how we get around this teleological problem. It's all about self-organization. It arises naturally. Things come into existence which seek to maintain their existence as the result of basic negentropic principles. And you mentioned the Markov blanket. Well, that's fundamental to how the soul works. A Markov blanket.
Did you say? You said this all. Sorry, I misheard you saying that's fundamental to how the soul works. And I thought,
no. Well, it is also fundamental to that. No, it's how it's so to have a self-organizing system, a system which separates itself from the not system. There has to be a boundary. There has to be something which sequesters the system from its entropic surrounds. something with some boundary which within these bounds I'm trying to resist dissipation, which is what the rest of the universe is doing. And the Markov blanket is that boundary, provides that boundary. It's a very complicated topic, but the important thing is that it is a purely physical and natural occurrence that these boundaries, these Markov blankets, emerge, enabling systems to separate themselves off from the entropic forces surrounding them and to maintain their own existence. And these, the Markov blanket sequesters the system in such a way that the external forces act upon the blanket, and then the blanket represents those external forces to the interior of the system, which then has to model what's going on outside and act accordingly. So the blanket has what we could put in inverted commas, sensory states and active states. Via the blanket, again, one step removed, the interior of the system can't directly act on the outside world, because then it would become one and the same. It would be part and parcel of its environs. In other words, it would be dissipative. So the blanket enables the internal states of the system to vicariously act on the external states surrounding the system. And in this way, you have the ground zero basis of selfhood and of intentionality, a system which represents its outside world to itself, which has values within itself, namely it's good to carry on existing and bad to not carry on existing. And this gives rise to proto-intentional actions that, on the basis of its representation of the surrounding states, via its blanket, the system acts on the world so as to preserve its own integrity. And just to add to the mix, while I'm at it, there too we have the basis of learning of what in biological systems, we call memory. That when the predicted outcome does not flow from the action, from the active states of the blanket, then the sensory states that were expected do not occur. That gives rise to what's called an error signal, which I mentioned earlier, and that error signal updates the predictive model. So the predictive model is the kind of physical precursor of our long-term memory systems. And so in what I've just described, we have a system which has values, namely it wants to carry on existing, that those values are the precursors of feelings, and it has intentional behavior, it has a memory system, it has a representational system. You see all of the basic building blocks of what we call minds, and what you called teleological systems. All of it has its origins in self-organizing systems, which were described by Ashby in 1947 already. But it's an absolutely fundamentally important bit of knowledge for us to be able to insert psychology into the fabric of everything else we know about how the universe works.
So to sort of wrap it all up then with the philosophical implications and questions that sort of I don't know, maybe lay at the basis of some of the investigation, but then also, like offer a kind of interpretation of piecing all the bits together. So, I mean, someone might be thinking, well, it's all very well and good that we've got this, that's what the brain does, or we've got this kind of Markov blanket, but it doesn't matter how complicated a sort of feedback and representation system you build up. You can keep adding, all the logic gates you want to this outer state, which represents it to an internal state. But why is there a what it's likeness for me, whereas there isn't for this cup or something like that? Why? How in that physical world of sort of but blind causation, as it were, how do you get that actual first person perspective, not sort of equivocation on the word representation in the same way that my camera is representing an image, but an actual perceiver, like I at least seem to be myself. What are some of the implications of all this, and how have they shaped your thinking on that question?
Well, so this problem of, why is there something it is like to be a living organism? Why is there something it is like to be anything at all? You're referring there to the hard problem. And you must remember that when it was first formulated in the 1990s, it was formulated in relation to cognitive neuroscience and the sorts of processes that I've pointed out are in fact not intrinsically conscious. Things like vision and hearing and remembering and cognition generally. Your mobile phone can do all of that, literally. And our cortex, as I said, does all of that unconsciously. So I think that the question of why is there something it is like arose from the fact that we were looking in the wrong place at the wrong sorts of functions. They are not intrinsically conscious things. So Chalmers was entirely correct to say, the functional mechanisms of these cognitive processes, you can explain how they work without there needing to be any something it is likeness involved. That's why it was so puzzling, and that's what led him to the conclusion that no mechanistic account of how the mind works will ever accommodate why there is something it is like to be a mind. Now, my point is that is true of vision and hearing and learning and all of these cognitive things, which, as I said, your phone can do. But it is not true of feelings. Feelings are intrinsically felt. There's no such thing as a feeling that you don't feel. And it's not a play on words, this. Don't forget. The source of consciousness in the brain is the part of the brain that generates feelings. So it seems as if what consciousness is there for is to generate feelings. If you have a mechanistic account of how feelings come about, it has to explain why they feel like something, because that's the whole point of them being there. So, I think that by shifting from cognition to affect, from cortex to brainstem, it really casts the hard problem in a very different light. Now, bearing that in mind, go back to what I said to you a few minutes ago. I was talking about how self-organizing systems, they have a value system, which is that they're literally, their raison d'être, even non-living self-organizing systems. The fundamental mechanistic principle is that everything they do has the goal of continuing to exist. And now all you need to do is complexify that system so that it has multiple needs. Now, this is what happens with living systems, from single cells to multicellular organisms. It's no longer just a matter of, I've got to stay within this temperature range and this, whatever. And there's a simple rule as to how to do it. You have multiple needs competing with each other, which need to be prioritized, and they can't all be reduced to a single common denominator, because they all have to be met in their own right. When you're thirsty, you have to drink. You can't say, I'll eat or I'll sleep, and in this way reduce my total need. So having multiple component needs like this, all of them ultimately in the service of keeping the system going, but complex systems, which complexify for good reasons. I perhaps don't need to go into that right now, but they do complexify and have multiple component needs, each of which needs to be met in their own right. So the goodness and badness then has to be categorized. You have to have categorical variables, which are qualitatively distinct variables. So the system's values of what's good and what's bad for it have to be parameterized across these multiple qualitatively distinctive variables, and there you start having the sort of ground zero basis of qualia. why qualia come into existence. It is simply what it is like to be a system that has multiple needs, which are qualitatively distinguishable and must be qualitatively, that is to say, categorically distinguishable from each other. And one more point is that because the system has this, it has an awareness that there is a feeling of how things are going, as opposed to a fixed algorithm. It can then adjust its behavior according to how things are panning out here and now, which enables the system to adjust to unpredicted environments, novel situations, to be able to feel your way through a problem. That's the basis of voluntary behavior, choice. Choices are made on the basis of, what do they say? Suck it and see. Is this good or is it bad? Being able to determine that on the hoof is what feelings add to these fixed algorithms that govern the behavior of single cellular organisms and so on. So this mystery of why is there something it is like to be a system, once we understand the principles that I've just outlined, I think it's not mysterious at all. The crucial step, and not everyone's willing to take that step, is you have to observe the situation from the system's point of view. You have to take the viewpoint of the system, because all of these variables I'm talking about only have existential consequences for the system. You have to be the system who has skin in the game, then it's not so hard to understand why there is something it is like to be a system of the kind that we've been talking about.
Awesome. So just to wrap up then, I guess the last question I've got is, what kind of research would you like to see coming out to either further this work and improve the explanation, or if it's wrong in certain areas, to falsify parts of it? Or, I mean, I guess you wouldn't want, if the whole thing was wrong, you wouldn't want it to be right either. So what do you want to see people who are interested in these questions, like picking up the baton and going forward with?
Well, I think that I'd like to say two things in relation to this closing question. The one is we must be very careful not to set a higher bar for science of consciousness than for the science of anything else. All that we need is testable predictions, and as long as what we predict is not falsified, then we have to provisionally assume, well, this system is conscious. So I'll give a quick example. Something as simple as a zebrafish, which I'm lighting on this example because these brainstem structures that I'm saying are the basic, provide the basic machinery for consciousness. We share them with all vertebrates. Fishes are vertebrates, and so you stimulate the periaqueductal gray or the reticular activating system in us, and we know what it feels like. This is good, this is bad. I want to avoid this. I approach that. And then you predict that if I stimulate those structures in this fish, the same ones as generate those responses in me, I predict it will generate the same responses in that creature. And every single time your prediction is confirmed. Then you predict, well, if I take... I'm not recommending this to our listeners, but cocaine or amphetamine or morphine or nicotine, all of which are bad for you but feel rather good. I predict that if my little fish has feelings, that it will be attracted to those substances. And guess what? They are. Zebrafish are very keen on all four of the things I've just mentioned. There's no good reason to go for those things other than that they feel good. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. Like we have to not set a different bar for consciousness than for anything else in science. But I will close with this. If you really if you really have the causal mechanism in your grasp as to how this thing works, how consciousness is generated, then you should be able to engineer it. Richard Feynman, the brilliant physicist, when he died, was written on his blackboard: if I can't create it, I don't understand it. And for me, that is the ultimate test. The ultimate test of any claim to have solved the hard problem is that you have to be able to generate an artificial consciousness in the rudimentary form of feelings. So to me, that's the ultimate test, and that's where I see this part of the neurosciences going right now. I'm not alone in thinking that. It's very much in the air. That what sounded just 10 years ago like absolute science fiction, a growing number of us, a very large growing number of us, mainstream neuroscientists, think that an artificial consciousness is sort of imminent.
Awesome. I've got so many more questions, but we'll wrap it up around there because we've hit the hour. So finally then, if people want to check out more of your stuff, if people want to get your book, what's the best place that you'd want people to go to buy it? Where can people find out what talks you're giving or future activities and things?
Well, first of all, I have to say the right thing, which is where I would like you to buy it, is at your local bookstore, rather than the easy Amazon and all of that. But of course, that's the easiest way to get it. But it is widely available. I implore you to order it through your bookstore. But otherwise, do the easy thing. As far as how to stay abreast of talks and whatnot, I'm on Twitter. I'm actively on Twitter. So I'm at Mark underscore Solms, MARK underscore SOLMS. So follow me on Twitter, and I always say there what's coming up. And also when I can provide recordings of things, I put the links up there.
Awesome. Great. Well, thank you for coming on. I'll end the stream there. And I'll put those links in the description for people as well, so they can go and check them out. If you want to hang around for 10 seconds, there'll just be like a closing credit thing, and then I'll just say bye and everything. But thank you everyone for watching. If you've enjoyed it, be sure to share it around with people and leave a comment letting me know what you think. Thank you.
Thank you.